steal away to Jesus, steal away home. I ain't got
Like I said, many of the soldiers that came from that was here was from northeast, and many of the in fact many of the soldiers when they joined up didn't have a last name. They just had a Joe or John, and they on the last name they knew was many times was names that was of their masters, and they took on those names, and they became like this guy William Ross. Now Ross could have been a slave owner, a slave plantation owner, especially guys, because usually people, the blacks from New Orleans usually would have French Creole type names like Lamoureux and Labrador, names like that. And many of the soldiers that joined up from the south that came from Alabama was from the Mandingo farms. They didn't have names. They just had, like numbers or brands. So many of them just, acquired a name after they got out here, and because they had no such thing as birth certificates. And then, in fact, some of them didn't even know how old they were, And the way they kept their age was by when certain things happened. I was born when my dad bought 2 mules or something like that, and from that time on, that's how they calculated their age. But many of the soldiers came from the 125th Cavalry, which came from the northeast right after the war.
Why don't we walk down the road a little bit?
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if that guy, he could be one of my distant relatives. I don't know. And
From the time that the regiments were authorized by Congress in July of 1866 and the months that it took to form the regiments to enlist and train the recruits, the primary job of the troopers was to learn how to handle their horses, how to drill, how to give the proper appearance in military review, and generally how to use their weapons. They began the westward deployment and were in the field continuously for over a decade, beginning in 1867. They entered New Mexico in the winter of 1875-76 to relieve the 8th Cavalry, which was a white regiment and had been stationed in southern New Mexico. And while they were here, they, well, from the time of the westward deployment, they had a number of different jobs that I think a lot of people are unaware of. And some of those included building the military posts at which they served. And one example of that is Fort Davis in West Texas, which had been a commissioned post before the Civil War, but was abandoned. And then it was occupied briefly by the Confederates. And when they left, they burned as much of it as they could. So the 9th Cavalry actually rebuilt Fort Davis. They did extensive scouting and escort service. They escorted military trains and civilian wagon trains and the mail. They strung telegraph lines and built roads, scouted water sources, and protected the settlers and miners that were moving into these areas and affecting the traditional ways of life of the Native American tribes.
Many of the other Buffalo soldiers and the soldiers in the infantry came here out of necessity. You know, they had nowhere else to go. Many of the soldiers who was in the 24th Infantry were soldiers that was remnants of the 125th Infantry that served in the Civil War itself. So they broke it down into the 24th Infantry and the 9th and the 10th Cavalry. And as I was telling someone earlier, the 24th Infantry was not the Buffalo soldiers. They were just infantry. The mounted cavalry were the soldiers that was considered the Buffalo soldiers. And they derived that name from the Comanches and the Apache Indians, not because they was fierce like buffaloes, but because of their kinky hair. They gave them that name.
All of the non-commissioned officers and privates were black, and then there were the Navajo Scouts, and all of the officers with rank of lieutenant and higher were white. At the time, well, let's see, it wasn't until 1876 that the first black graduated from the military academy.
Times were tough on the plantations, and when the Civil War was over, many of them in the Reconstruction period had their same jobs again on plantations doing the same work, but they were paid. But others who were more adventurous wanted to join the Army and did, and I think had a better life and were able to get out of the American South. And they did, and they came in the 9th and 10th Cavalry units to the American West, and they were formed in 1866. And the 9th Cavalry and the 10th Cavalry. I think life was better for them, but I think they probably certainly missed their families. They were isolated, and I would suspect that a lot of them had regrets about joining the Army. I really think so. Given the situation they were in and the greenery and so forth and so on of the East, and coming to far different dry areas in the West, I think a lot of them had regrets.
It was very poor. I think I read somewhere where they made about 38 cents a day. It wasn't very much. And it wasn't just for the Buffalo soldiers. It was for both the white soldiers and the black soldiers. Actually, there were times when the Buffalo soldiers and the 24th Infantry was given some of the worst assignments, some of the most harsh assignments. But many of those men were very used to harsh treatments. You know, many of them had served their slavery, and many of them had fought through the war. So they were used to it, and it wasn't anything new to them. And they did more than fight Indians. You know, they put up telegraph lines, they built roads, they built forts, and then after they built the forts, they were protectors. They helped escort wagon trains. They did all kinds of things, you know, other than just fight Indians, because they didn't spend all day long and all night long fighting Indians. You know, there were other things that they did.
They were more isolated, they were more segregated, And when they came to town, there were certain places they could go and certain places they couldn't go. As far as entertainment is concerned, there's always bunk fatigue, which is sleeping. There is music and harmonicas and things of that nature, and singing that they had. There's baseball. In the 1880s, there's bicycling. Some of the younger kids roller skated in the 1880s. There's horse racing, and usually the officers would have horses, and they would race them, and horses against mules, and they would bet a lot of money. So there's boxing. Also, I didn't mention boxing. They had boxing matches. I remember one boxing match went 101 rounds. And boxing in that time was different from today. It's one threw in the sponge or threw in the towel and quit. That was the end of the fight. But they'd go on long and hard, some terrible battles. That particular fight of 101 rounds went about 3 hours or 3.5 hours. It was a very, very long fight. And there were soldiers who were known as strikers or dog robbers who would work with a officer and be with an officer, live or provide services of chopping wood and milking cows and doing things of that nature. Then the officers often had servants, a servant girl that would cook and live there and take care of the children. And those girls often were Irish because of the influx of Irish into the United States. And they would come from employment agencies such as Chicago and elsewhere, and the officer would pay the transportation out here of the young girl, the Irish colleen. But they wouldn't stay very long because there was a scarcity of women at all of these forts, and they would marry. And so the officer would then get another girl and ask for the ugliest one that they could, and often get the ugliest one, but that made no difference either because they would marry. And then there was a tendency in the American West to go to Chinese men, and they would serve as the cooks, but the soldiers didn't like that. They couldn't go to the dances with them and so forth and so on.
Well, the job primarily was the same as any other enlisted man. Well, you receive your orders, you do what you was told. But during that time, you had the Indians who was very unsettled on the reservations. You had Geronimo, Victorio, Nana, and several other Indians who was on the rampage. So the U.S. Army needed all of the help that they could get. And like I said before, many of the black men, their only alternative to survive was to join the military. But they fought along with the other white soldiers. They just had different tasks, different assignments. I don't know of any recorded incident where they actually fought together, but they was fighting the same enemy, just maybe at different times and different places.
There is a slight difference. The Buffalo Soldiers and the white troops did not receive the same equipment on the same level. Because of the racial discrimination of the time, the black soldiers would receive the most inferior equipment, also the most inferior supplies. This is just a part of history. This at the time was a normal procedure. The black soldiers were not considered the equivalent of the white soldiers, although generals like Sherman did grudgingly respect their actions and their behavior, and many times admit that they were the equivalent of white soldiers. However, the black mortality rate would be a bit higher because, as in most wars, the blacks would be sent into the heat of the battle first.
They did have some, well, when they went out on long haul, as they call it, they had wagons, and usually the infantry guys, rode the wagon or drove the wagon, and then they had also had a blacksmith, to help take care of the horses and stuff. But usually, they didn't go on very long excursions because they were not really familiar with the terrain, and they was chasing, people who were, so they didn't go too far away from their support. So most of the time it was short excursions, But when they went out on a big campaign, the 24th Infantry, all of them kind of like combined in wagons and on foot and on horseback. But many times when they got news, and it wasn't like somebody picked up the telephone and called, hey, look, Victoria's over in Silver City, let's go. Sometime when they got news of a renegade being somewhere, here it might be 5 or 6 days before they get the news, and then maybe another 5 or 6 days before they get to where the renegades actually were, So it wasn't like to jump in a jeep and they're there, a helicopter, it was time consuming.
The uniform that was issued to soldiers during the Indian Wars was the same uniform that was used throughout the Civil War. The uniform that I'm wearing is an 1858 pattern uniform, which consists of your footwear. You were either issued boots or shoes, depending on the branch of the service you were in. Your trousers were 100% wool. Underneath your trousers, you had your long underwear. Now, on top, you had 3 layers. You had a wool jacket. This is called a 4-button sack coat that was used clear up into even the 1880s. Underneath your sack coat, you had a cotton or a muslin shirt, and under that, again, your long underwear. This was the uniform that you wore year-round. You didn't have a summer uniform or a winter uniform. And this actually, during the hot summer months out in New Mexico, this worked to your advantage, because with the 2 layers on the bottom, the 3 layers on the top, what happens is you sweat, and your undergarments can become completely soaked. And the wool then breathes. So basically, you become a walking swamp cooler. You cool by evaporation. Now, up here, this is what you would have been issued. This is called a forage cap. As you can see, it's got a lot of material to it, hence the word forage for gathering supplies and what have you. Now, as far as your equipment is concerned, all your soldiers were issued a haversack. This was your ration bag, where you kept all of your food and your cooking utensils and your cup as well. You were issued, of course, a canteen. This is an early model cartridge box, and the belt with the U.S. oval equipped with the cap pouch. Now, this was used for the older weapons, which were this type of a weapon, which were the muzzle loaders. Basically, what that means is this is the muzzle end of the gun, and this is where you load it. These weapons took a paper cartridge, and you needed a little brass cap to ignite them. You loaded it through the barrel. You used your ramrod, of course, to ram the cartridge down, and then you placed a percussion cap on this nipple right here, and then you could discharge the weapon. Now, a soldier back then, with this type of a weapon, a good soldier could load and fire 3 aim shots in a minute. Now, although the uniform regulations didn't change for many years after the war was over, the weapons were constantly changing. And in the late 60s and early 1870s, what they did was they took a lot of these old muzzle-loading rifles and they modified them to a breech loading rifle. What they did is they cut the breech end of the rifle out and they installed a receiver, like so. Now that enabled them to fire a metallic cartridge, like so. The soldier would fall in at the shoulder arms position, like so. His command would be given load. At the command of load, you take a half a step back, bring your weapon down, open your breech, install your cartridge, bring it to a full cock, you're ready to discharge the weapon. Now all we have to do is aim and fire.
Most soldiers learn that if they're not going to use their rifle and their muzzle loaders, their pistols would simply be put aside during battle once they were empty. You simply wouldn't have the time to reload a pistol, but you would have time to reload a rifle because the muzzle is a simple ram and much easier to get at. Also, that's why you'll find something like this here Arkansas toothpick. Most fellers will have something like it. The purpose of that is to keep your hide going while the fellers are leaping on you when you're unloaded. You want to have something to fight with. You'll have a pistol in one hand, knife in the other. And you'll use them both as clubs more than as fighting, as cutting instruments. This is a B&N Colt, 36 caliber. It was used by, nope, that'd be too long, so. A young fella named Wyatt Earp used one just like this. But usually for the infantry, they didn't have handguns, just rifles. The cavalry would use these and much similar pistol, but a Remington had a 8.5-inch barrel. Other than that, they're very similar. Let's step over here. Let's say after that. The medicine bag, which after it is filled, inside would be certain select stones, the bones of certain animals, depending upon which one is representative of you, and maybe a few discrete herbals. And then it's sealed. When it's worn around your neck, then it is thought to make you invulnerable to bullets. That's why most of our soldiers, black and white, if given the opportunity, got themselves a medicine bag. Not all believed it, but why take a chance? Well, in close, you would find a little bit of fatality. The problem with these types of weapons, and the problem with any type of weapons, is that you're simply not going to get an enormous fatality rate. You're going to get a lot of wounded, but you're not going to get a lot of killed, simply because these bullets don't have a tendency to expand. They'll flatten and will not penetrate all the way through. They'll stop in the body on some section instead of tearing a hole through you for the most part, making you more likely to be wounded than killed unless you have a fatal organ shot. On the other hand, in close, as stated, most fellers would be using either their bowie or their tomahawks. They're much more efficient in close range. Among other things, this bowie knife, this would be a bit of a service knife, and there would always be your usual straight razor. This is almost all of your surgical kit. There is your removal pincers and your grope and pullers to get bullets out, to punch holes, to sew up wounds. The quartermaster will have with him a bone saw, and I believe that pretty much speaks for itself.
Kathy Williams served in the 38th Infantry, disguised as a man, William Cathy. She was a private, and she was roughly 16 years old when she enlisted in 1866 in November in St. Louis, Missouri.
I, William Cathy, born in Independence in the state of Missouri, aged 22 years and by occupation a cook, do hereby acknowledge to have voluntarily enlisted this 15th day of November, 1866, as a soldier in the Army of the United States of America.
She then was sent to Jefferson Barracks, and by early the next year, in 1867, the company Company A was formed, and she was one of the men who was mustered in. They then started westward marching and spent brief times at Fort Riley, Kansas, and Fort Harker, and continued westward, and by July of 1867 they had arrived at Fort Union, New Mexico, after marching about 540 miles. After spending a couple of, just a brief time there, they set out in early September and marched southward and arrived at Fort Cummings on October 1st of that year. William Cathy was not ever discovered during her almost 2 years in the military. It is still a mystery as to why she disguised herself, and to date she's the only known African American woman who did so. Certainly during that time, right after the Civil War, the military was a very attractive option for African American men. The private's pay of $13 a month was a lot more than they could earn in civilian life, and so it really attracted a lot of them, and possibly that was her motivation as well, some economic benefit from that. It's also been speculated that she might have been married to or romantically attached to one of the men in the company, although we will really never know the answers to either of those questions, why she did that. But she did do it successfully. And it's kind of interesting that right after the Civil War, when enlistees were mustered into service, they were given a very cursory, we can imagine, examination by a medical doctor. Her examination evidently was, the doctor proclaimed her fit for duty and listed her as being very large. She weighed 160 pounds according to her enlistment papers. She was 5'9" and had black hair, eyes, and skin.
I certify, on honor, that I have minutely inspected the recruit, William Cathy, previously to his enlistment, and that he was entirely sober when enlisted, that to the best of my judgment and belief he is of lawful age, and that, in accepting him as duly qualified to perform the duties of an able-bodied soldier, I have strictly observed the regulations which govern the recruiting service. This soldier has black eyes, black hair, black complexion, is 5 feet 9 inches high. Signed, Recruiting Officer.
At Fort Cummings, they overwintered, and in January of 1868 she became very ill. And she had been in and out of hospitals during the 2 years almost that she served, 5 times, 5 different hospitals. And some of those stays were quite long, up to 3 months. So that's another question about the medical care that she received at the time, because she was never discovered until October of 1868, when the company had moved to Fort Bayard, and she entered the post hospital there, complaining of an illness or some unspecified complaint. And it was then that it was finally discovered that William Cathy was in fact Cathy Williams, and she was given a certificate of disability and discharged. She then went back to Fort Union, where she returned to the occupation that she had had before she entered the military. She was a cook for one of the officers' families there. And she made her way to Trinidad, Colorado, where she applied for her Army pension, and she was examined there by a doctor who was working for the Bureau of Pensions in 1897. And this really adds more mystery to her story, I think, than anything, because the examination revealed that she had lost all of her toes. Every single one of her toes had been amputated, and she could only walk with the aid of a crutch, with a cane. Unfortunately, the doctor not only failed to note how she had lost her toes, but we don't even know who he was, because on all of the papers that he signed, his signature is entirely illegible.
I, Kathy Williams, of lawful age, and being first duly sworn according to law, upon oath say that in the month of October, year 1868, at the city of St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, affiant then being in the regular military service of the United States, contracted smallpox, on account of which affiant was placed in the hospital for treatment. That a very short time thereafter affiant was discharged from the hospital and was sent with her company, Company A, 38th Regiment, U.S. Infantry, to Fort Bayard, New Mexico. That at the time of her discharge from the hospital, affiant had not recovered from all of the effects of said disease, and still suffered from the effects of said illness during the trip from St. Louis in New Mexico. Affiant was compelled to swim said river, and by reason of such exposure and hardship, and by reason of effects of the smallpox from which affiant had barely recovered, affiant became very ill, and among other things resulted in deafness, as claimed by affiant in her application for a pension on file, by which she claims the right to pension. And affiant further states that on account of said last mentioned illness, she was then finally discharged at Fort Bayard, New Mexico, from service. Signed, Kathy Williams, alias William Kathy.
The mystery of Kathy Williams is something that still interests people very much, because her pension was denied. And at the time, there were 5 reasons why pensions were denied. One was that the applicant was ineligible because they were a deserter. The pension could be denied because the disability existed prior to military service, or because it was unrelated to the military service, or that the military service was illegal, which one would certainly have thought would have been the reason for disallowing her pension, because in the 1800s there was a ban on women serving in the military. However, her pension was denied for the 5th reason, and that was that no disability existed, even though she had to use a cane to walk and had lost all of her toes. We don't know what happened to her after that. She was not listed on the 1900 census records, and attempts to locate a gravesite have not, in the Raton, Trinidad area, have not turned up anything. So although she was a trailblazer, she probably never knew it, and probably was not setting out to blaze any trails, but she certainly left a lot of questions behind.
to get here, we rode horseback about 5 miles, would you say, roughly? Something like 5 to 7 miles. It took us about 3 hours. We came over this ridge here, and I don't know the name of it, Billy, but it was rather steep on the other side and steep on this side, so we came across from north of Kingston, and we came up Cave Creek, past Cave Creek, it's past the cave itself, and down into Las Animas Creek. It was quite a ride. It was in 1879, as you see by this marker, that Apache scouts, or Apaches I should say, up in Massacre Canyon, came in contact with Buffalo soldiers of the 9th Cavalry, and this cavalry unit was headed by Navajo scouts who led them up into Massacre Canyon. A number were killed. This monument names Peter Haynes and Jay Crump and John Johnson, Navajo scouts who were killed on September the 18th, 1879. And then behind me, this particular monument is to some unknown soldiers who were killed on the same date. They were Buffalo soldiers. Then there were a number of men who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award this nation can give. And these people were mentioned, or are mentioned, the Second Lieutenant Matthias Day, and then Sergeant John Denny, also of the 9th Cavalry, and also Robert Emmett. And they were given the Congressional Medal of Honor for heroism, rescuing wounded soldiers under enemy fire up in this canyon, which we call Massacre Canyon. This is Victorio Peak that I'm pointing to now, and the canyon lies just on this side of it, and we're going to be going over there. These are the graves of the Buffalo soldiers and some of the Navajo scouts who were killed in this battle of Massacre Canyon. And they were killed by Apaches under Victorio in 1879 in this particular battle along Las Animas Creek. This is the creek that lies just over here on the other side of these trees, and the canyon lies over in this area. Well, here I am standing in Massacre Canyon. The troops came up Animas Creek, then up the canyon through here to this notch. And where you see this notch and this excellent fortification from the Apache point of view, you had the battle take place against the 9th Cavalry troops led by Navajo scouts, and 3 of those scouts were killed, and of course a number of Buffalo soldiers were killed, and this fierce fighting took place in the canyon. We had walked up this canyon, and there's sort of a ridge that divides it, but Massacre Canyon is over here, and there's really a thought that they came up this canyon on horseback, Massacre Canyon, to that V where they were attacked. If I were doing it, and the report says it began down here in Animas Creek, I would have fired on them and had my men run and be chased by the cavalry, and I would lead them right up to that point. But that's conjecture. We just don't know everything that happened. But that would be logical. I'd want to be sure that the cavalry followed and got to that point without question.
where I would have had my men in waiting and I would have attacked them. Just about 100 yards up this canyon is a plaque placed here commemorating this battle in Massacre Canyon, also referred to as Las Animas. We're looking at the mouth of the canyon and swinging around. Some of these defensive works, undoubtedly, used by the Apaches would have been here. They're already here. They wouldn't have to pile the rocks up, and as a soldier, you would be shooting at these rocks, and there's just the possibility that some of these marks where I'm pointing down here are those made by bullets that were fired by the soldiers at these rocks.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Ready! Fire! Hear the piece.
Yes, sir, I am. Let's go, let's go, let's see what you got.
Ooh. First.
One bound.
One bound. One bound.
Let's go, Ray. Good on him. Take the ball.
Come on, Aaron. Oh!
You tipping? No, I wish it.
You go out there and tickle the first baseman or something.
I think we should put a blindfold on.
I hope you guys got enough exercise out there. Renegotiate your contract.
Keep them on. We like that. Yeah, now that's how you play baseball. Good. Yeah. Hurler, you doing good today.
the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed his faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His true